We begin our news with the escalating rhetoric between President Trump and Russian officials, with no signs of a ceasefire in Ukraine and tensions only rising. Just before noon yesterday, the president posted on social media that if it wasn't for him, quote, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. Trump goes on to add that Russian President Vladimir Putin is playing with fire. Hours later, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, responded to Trump's post directly, writing, quote, I only know of one really bad thing, World War III. I hope Trump understands this. The Russian state media outlet RT also responded to Trump's post, outright mocking him, writing, quote, Trump's message leaves little room for misinterpretation until he posts the opposite tomorrow morning.
Obviously, this is Donald Trump is experiencing what Joe Biden and what Barack Obama and what George W. Bush have experienced before him. Vladimir Putin plays by his own rules on his own timeline. And he spends as much time as he can trying to sucker American presidents. And he's done it now for the past 20 years. Looks like Donald Trump understands that right now that's what's starting to happen. He's starting to understand that. And you also see in the Senate very interesting Republicans now finally starting to step up and saying enough's enough. I mean, the consequences, Wall Street Journal talks about it today. Us bowing down to Russia, Donald Trump allowing Russia to keep doing this to Ukraine sends a very clear and unmistakable message to China, which is invade Taiwan.
Open season.
And the White House won't do anything about it. And it will be open season on Taiwan, open season on Ukraine, then open season on Poland. You go down the list. It is Trump's foreign policy crossroads right now. We all remember Joe Biden not listening to his generals, not listening to his admirals, and pulling all the troops out of Afghanistan. His approval rating was at 54% when he did that. A week later, it was below 50%. He never got over 50% again. This is truly a crossroads, and it looks, at least for now, like Donald Trump is pushing back hard, along with the Republicans in the Senate, finally pushing back hard on Vladimir Putin.
Well, it's fascinating that the Republican senators now have gone so hard against Putin, calling for more sanctions, led by Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, now that it feels safe to, because there looks to be an opening as President Trump has voiced now publicly his frustration with Vladimir Putin. As Russian media said yesterday, we'll see how long this lasts for Donald Trump, if he can be flattered again into giving Vladimir Putin what he wants. That remains to be seen. But it's very interesting that Russia, for a decade now and longer before he was president, has used flattery to get into the good graces of Donald Trump, and it has worked by and large. And now they're sort of mocking him a little bit. They're saying he's become emotional, that they say he'll change his mind tomorrow. Don't worry about what he says. Only further enraging President Trump. And we'll see now if he listens to those Republican senators. Let's turn to NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, who, of course, has been covering the war in Ukraine since its beginning. Richard, what do you make of this back and forth between the Kremlin and President Trump?
So I think we're seeing a new strategy, a new media strategy, a new Donald Trump approach strategy from Vladimir Putin and from Russia. Many countries, from Europe to Ukraine to recently saw the South African president, have been struggling to deal with Donald Trump. They don't want to be publicly embarrassed with him. I know certain countries, I've spoken to governments, they're reluctant to send their leaders to the White House because they don't want one of these embarrassing moments where they're forced to kind of sit on their hands and look awkwardly and apologize and be obsequious to President Trump. It happened to the King of Jordan. It's happened several times. And now we're seeing Russia take the opposite approach, where Vladimir Putin is now openly being rude to President Trump. The state media in Russia saying, well, President Trump says this until he flip-flops, until he changes his mind the next day. Dmitry Peskov said that what Trump is doing now is because of his, quote, emotional reaction and emotional overload. So they're trying to goad him a little bit, trying to see what kind of reaction. And the question is, for what purpose? Do they assume that sanctions are coming either way? So if they're coming, you may as well earn them. Or are they trying to frustrate him? And analysts that I'm speaking to believe that they are trying to frustrate him, that it is ultimately in Russia's interest, in Vladimir Putin's interest, if President Trump, as he says he's going to do, just lifts up his hands and walks away. Say, these people don't want peace. I don't want to deal with this. I have other things to worry about. He could be busy fighting with American universities or fighting with immigration at home, that he ignores Russia, ignores this peace portfolio, which he said was going to be so easy, and that analysts believe that if he does do that, that it would favor Vladimir Putin because he would have more room to operate, more room to carry out his war in Ukraine, which is obviously ongoing. So it's a different approach. Instead of trying to appeal to his ego, maybe frustrate him enough into giving up interest on the war in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Richard, as this public back and forth plays out in front of the world, Vladimir Putin is marching on with his aims inside Ukraine, escalating, attacking civilian targets, drone strikes, missiles inside of Ukraine, the largest aerial assault a few days ago since this war began. What is the strategy there that during ostensible ceasefire talks, ostensible peace talks, he's escalating his war?
Well, there are no real ceasefire talks at this stage, and there's a lot of ceasefire theater. You saw President Zelensky of Ukraine go to Turkey, where there was some talk that maybe Putin himself would show up, and instead there were these images of Zelensky, the peacemaker, there alone. Trump expressing, frustration that this isn't going anywhere. And then President Trump saying that he's surprised. He's surprised at the way Vladimir Putin is angry. Why is he behaving like this? He's not behaving as if he wants to have a peace deal because he's still attacking Kyiv. He's still sending rockets. He's still sending drones. He's not behaving like someone who's looking for a peace deal. So perhaps it's just dawned on President Trump that Putin doesn't want a peace deal, but wants a piece of Ukraine, if not all of the country. And if that is in fact the case, then the best thing that could happen for Vladimir Putin was that the U.S., which is not just a peace broker here, but is the main guarantor of Ukraine's stability, the main supplier of intelligence and weapons, that if the U.S. just walks away, it benefits the Kremlin.
So, Richard, then there's this. Here's what the Wall Street Journal editorial board writes in a piece entitled Trump's Foreign Policy Crossroads. Quote, President Trump's foreign policy has been coasting so far on his verbal threats and public cajoling, but he'll soon face moments of decision on U.S. adversaries that will echo throughout his second term and could determine his legacy. Mr. Trump has mused about leaving Russia and Ukraine to fight it out, but walking away won't insulate America from the consequences. If Ukraine succumbs, Mr. Putin will advance his forces closer to more of the NATO border. As important, Mr. Trump will send a message to Chinese President Xi Jinping that the U.S. can't sustain support for an ally under siege. Beijing will conclude that its support for Russia's war carried little cost and that its alliance with Russia has paid off. The message will be that if China moves on Taiwan, Mr. Trump is unlikely to respond with more than verbal protests or toothless sanctions. Instead of restoring U.S. deterrence, Mr. Trump would further undermine it.
And Richard, this is something that Republican senators have been warning Donald Trump about. Walking away is what Joe Biden did in Afghanistan. Walking away is what remains the turning point in his presidency, where his poll numbers went below 50% and never went above there. And as Lindsey Graham says, if you think Afghanistan was bad, walking away from Ukraine would make that look like a spring picnic. Talk about that side of things, what the consequences of America just, quote, walking away, how badly things become. And also the fears and concerns that you've heard from foreign policy leaders, world leaders, diplomats about the message it would send to Xi on Taiwan if Donald Trump and Americans were to walk away from Ukraine now.
So if the U.S. walked away from Ukraine, it would be considered an enormous betrayal for Ukraine. It would be America breaking its promise. There have been many, many agreements. So it's not just verbal agreements. There have been many written agreements between the United States and Ukraine to provide weapons, to provide logistics, to provide arms, to provide intelligence, to support the Ukrainian economy. The U.S. has emerged as Ukraine's main backer in this. So does walking away and allowing the two sides to fight it out, as President Trump has threatened, does that mean that the U.S., that President Trump would no longer just be this active peace broker, that he would stop making the phone calls? Or would it mean, as I think Russia hopes it means, walking away, meaning we're done with this, this is Europe's problem, we have no interest in Ukraine, and hoping that it just stays a European conflict? So the U.S. reputational damage would be enormous. The Ukrainians would feel abandoned. I think Europe would be very frightened that it has to handle security for itself on every level. And that is probably a long-term positive thing. Many Europeans believe that this wake-up call is a necessary wake-up call. But it can't happen that rapidly because they're not in a position to take care of their own security for several more years. They're in a situation where they're dependent on not just NATO, but on American cooperation. So if the U.S. leaves the biggest security challenge in Europe right now, it effectively leaves Europe and leaves the European security framework. It would be destabilizing for Europe. It would be devastating for Ukraine. And of course, it clearly sends a message to China, that if the U.S. is walking away from a security challenge in Europe, why wouldn't it walk away from another security challenge in China? So the repercussions of simply walking away and what walking away means could be one of the most important decisions taken by President Trump in terms of foreign policy. You mentioned President Biden thinking he could just walk away from Afghanistan. Afghanistan, at the end of the day, is a small, landlocked Central Asian country that the U.S. had been there for 20 years. Walking away from that had consequences. It was the betrayal of a generation of young people in Afghanistan. Walking away from Europe's biggest security challenge in modern times would not go unnoticed by China and would have a much broader impact than walking away from Afghanistan, without a doubt.
Exactly.
Certainly gives a little perspective there. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, live from Lisbon. Thank you so much for coming on this morning.